Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to explore the life of a guy who didn't just play a game, he completely re-engineered it from the ground up. We're looking at Aron Nimzowitsch, the Maverick architect of hypermodern chess. He's arguably the most influential chess thinker of the entire 20th century. If you've ever found yourself wanting to totally upend the established rules of a system, well, you are absolutely going to love his story.
Okay, let's dive right into this, because right out of the gate, we're hit with this massive paradox. The most influential chess thinker of the 20th century never actually played for a world championship. And it wasn't because he lacked the talent, no way. It was really just due to a lack of financial backing, which, was a strict requirement for a title match back in those days. But here's the really incredible part. Even without that official crown, his ideas fundamentally changed how the game was played by literally every master who came after him.
So, to really understand his genius, we kind of have to establish the stakes here. In the early 1900s, chess was completely ruled by the dogmatic classical school. The prevailing rule of the day was that you absolutely must physically occupy the center of the board with your pawns. Actually, scratch that. It wasn't just a rule, it was treated like an unbreakable law of physics. But Nimzowitsch, he was the ultimate chess maverick. He looked at these supposed unbreakable rules and basically decided, nope, you're all wrong. He proved that controlling the center from afar with your pieces, what we call the hypermodern approach, was just as powerful, if not more so, than stubbornly taking up space with your pawns.
So where exactly does a rebel like this come from? Well, he was born in 1886 in Riga, Latvia, which was part of the Russian Empire back then, to a wealthy Jewish timber merchant who also happened to be a very strong amateur player. Fast forward to 1904, and young Aron travels to Berlin to study philosophy. But instead of actually going to class, he spent practically all of his time hanging out at the famous Kaiserhof chess cafe. He ended up dropping out of university entirely to become a professional player, and his rise was just meteoric. By 1913, he tied for first place at the All-Russian Masters tournament with none other than a young Alexander Alekhine. But right as his career was really taking off, world history completely intervened. The absolute chaos of the 1917 Russian Revolution totally disrupted his trajectory. Nimzowitsch found himself physically trapped in the Baltic war zone. The whole world around him was basically descending into violence and uncertainty, which obviously put his life and his promising chess career in extreme jeopardy.
And honestly, this is where his absolutely brilliant eccentricity really shines through. Facing the terrifying prospect of being drafted into the military during all this chaos, Nimzowitsch had to think several moves ahead in real life. So how did he escape the draft? He faked madness. And not just any madness. He did it by deadpan insisting to the medical examiners that a fly was constantly buzzing around and landing on his head. I mean, you literally have to appreciate the strategic absurdity of that. And the craziest part, it completely worked. The bizarre act kept him right out of the military.
Now, what's really interesting about this period is how his chaotic movements as a refugee eventually led to his intellectual sanctuary. He first escaped to Berlin, and he briefly adopted the first name Arnold just to avoid the rising anti-Semitic persecution. But then, in 1922, he finally settled down in Copenhagen, Denmark. He found a permanent base there, living in this really small, humble, rented room for the rest of his life. And it was right there, in that quiet isolation, that his revolutionary ideas would fully take shape.
So, let's see how all this builds into the real intellectual meat of his story. The 1920s became the stage for a seriously intense ideological war in the chess world. It was a classic David versus Goliath battle. On one side, representing the classical establishment, you had Siegbert Tarrasch. He firmly believed in strict, formalistic rules. And on the other side, Nimzowitsch, who was totally ready to shatter those assumptions with the hypermodern school. This wasn't just some minor disagreement on moves, it was a fundamental clash on the very philosophy of how the game should even be played.
The crucial point here is defining exactly what this rebellion looked like on the board. Hypermodern chess is, well, it's beautifully counterintuitive. Instead of rushing to occupy the center yourself, you deliberately invite your opponents to push their pawns right into the middle of the board. You let them think they're totally dominating. But in reality, you're letting them turn their own pawns into these overextended, weak targets that you can aggressively attack from afar. It's basically a strategy of intellectual ambush.
And to make this abstract concept actionable, Nimzowitsch broke it down into an easily digestible and absolutely deadly three-part process. Step 1. Restrain the enemy's pawns so they can't advance freely. Step 2. Blockade them entirely, halting their momentum dead in its tracks. And finally, Step 3. Destroy. By organizing his incredibly complex philosophy into this clear step-by-step maxim, he gave players a terrifyingly effective blueprint for dismantling the classical style.
Of course, he needed a way to share this blueprint with the world, which brings us to 1925 and the publication of his masterwork, My System. And guys, this isn't just a chess book. It's widely considered one of the most important chess books of all time. My System took these radical ideas out of his head and introduced mass audiences to completely novel concepts. Things like overprotection, which is defending a strong point even more than strictly necessary, and the tactical power of the blockade.
And he didn't just write about these ideas, he actually proved them over the board. By the late 1920s, he had reached his absolute peak dominance, securing his place in the top 3 players worldwide. Literally, the only men ahead of him were the actual world champions themselves, José Raúl Capablanca and Alexander Alekhine. His crowning achievement came when he won the Carlsbad 1929 tournament. He finished ahead of the absolute strongest players of his era, completely validating his hypermodern theories on the world's biggest stage.
As we approach the climax of his career, I want you to imagine a very specific scenario on the chessboard. How do you defeat an opponent who hasn't lost their army? Just picture sitting across from someone who still has all their major pieces on the board. They're completely ready to fight, and yet they are completely paralyzed. How is that even possible?
Well, the answer lies in a wonderfully agonizing German word, Zugzwang. It's a situation in chess where it's your turn to move, but absolutely every possible move available to you leads to disaster or the loss of your material. You're forced to ruin your own position simply because you aren't allowed to pass your turn. And this brilliantly illustrates the ultimate goal of Nimzowicz's strategy, just total, suffocating control. Which brings us to the stuff of absolute legend, the 1923 immortal Zugzwang game in Copenhagen against the master Friedrich Semisch. Nimzowitsch applied his system so flawlessly here, executing the restrain and blockade steps with such suffocating precision that Semisch was squeezed entirely out of options. Despite having plenty of pieces left on the board, Semisch looked down and realized he had literally 0 moves that wouldn't immediately lose him the game. In sheer helpless paralysis, he was forced to resign. It's still one of the most famous games ever played.
Sadly, Nimzowicz's life was cut tragically short when he died of pneumonia in 1935. He was just 48 years old. But his legacy? It's immortal. The openings named after him, most notably the Nimzo Indian Defense, are still heavily played at the very highest levels of World Championship chess today. His book, My System, became the foundational chess Bible for future world champions like Tigran Petrosian. He might have been an uncrowned king in his own time, but his ideas absolutely laid the groundwork for the modern game.
Which leaves us with this final thought to ponder as we wrap up this explainer. Does true greatness require a crown, or just a revolution? Nimzowitsch never secured that official title, but his intellectual legacy far outlived the official world champions of his era. So the next time you see someone challenge the way things have always been done, remember the man who let his opponents march forward, only to pull the entire board right out from under them. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the rules.